Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today our guest is Jared Farmer. And the title of his book, and a most unusual book it is Trees in Paradise, A California History. And I think I oversimplify when I say that this is a history of California as told or seen through its trees. But your publisher, W.W. Norton, also says this. The author sets out to document the repeated rise and fall of the state's fortunes by way of the trees that came to dominate the landscape. The history of trees, your publisher says, is the history of California. Do you buy that?
I do. Well, I wrote the book, so I have to. I didn't write the copy, but yeah, I basically agree with that. California, is an incredible place, full of superlatives, and especially with trees. I think sometimes we forget that this is a place with the oldest, the tallest, the biggest trees in the world. It's the only place in the whole world that has 3 national parks dedicated to megaflora. We got Redwood National Park, Sequoia, Joshua Tree. We have the most valuable tree crops in America and probably the world. We have a virtual monopoly on all of the Mediterranean nuts and fruits that come from trees. And our gardens and our parks and our arboretum here are more cosmopolitan and just diverse than any other place in America. It's an incredible floral landscape. It's really a landscape revolution. And I guess I want to kind of show that this is one of the great changes wrought by settlers in California after the gold rush. And I would say just as important as gold in the long run, bringing millions and billions of trees to places where there weren't trees before.
One of the other things that one of the people who's read the book in advance says, this is David Quammen, he says that Jared Farmer is an important voice within this core, peering at California as landscape and dreamscape. He sees the forest for the trees. So that's the other thing that this book does. And it's a little hard to get your arms around that. You go beyond, the flora to all the other stuff that's going on.
Yes, this is not a botanical history. I'm not a forester or a scientist. This is not like a dry textbook. It's a long form, I think pretty fun history of the entire state, coast to coast, north to south, from 1848 to the present, told through trees. And I'm looking at trees in their multiple lives because, trees are organisms. They can be wild, but they can be planted. They can be cultivated. They can be in cities. They can be in rural spaces.
And in some cases, they have to be planted and cultivated, the whole citrus group, for example.
Yeah, they can be cloned, and but also they can be artificial. They can also be symbolic. And California, more than any other state, has promoted itself, advertised itself through trees, especially palm trees, orange trees. So I'm looking at trees in lots of different ways, not just as biological organisms. That's part of the story, but also as things people dream about, think about, fight over, draw, paint, write poetry about, but also, grow and harvest, like the full kind of spectrum of trees and the relationship with people.
And one of the other things I think that your book suggests is that the politics of the state is not dominated by trees, but trees certainly play a large part.
Well, yeah, if you think of the history of, conservation, preservation, environmentalism in California, trees are right up front and center. The original national park in the world, Yosemite, was initially about just Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of sequoia trees. So trees are right there at the beginning of the American conservation movement. And I'm sure your listeners remember the long, drawn-out, century-long fight to save certain stands of very tall redwood trees and how that really dominated California environmental politics for many decades in the 20th century. Or if you just think here in the Bay Area, the tree sitters in Berkeley, or the fights neighbors get in over eucalyptus trees, or the current battles over Mount Sutra Forest or the eucalyptus forest above UC Berkeley. Trees show up in a lot of different ways.
The book is organized into 4 parts. one part for each tree that you're interested in. And the 4 sections cover, first of all, the redwoods.
Yes.
Then the eucalyptus trees, or eucalypts, as it should be said.
Well, you can say eucalyptus to talk about the whole kind of class of trees, but if you talk about like individual trees, I usually say eucalypt.
Yeah.
Citruses, oranges and lemons primarily.
And grapefruits. Don't forget.
And mandarins. There's a bit of,
Yeah, mandarins are in there. And palm trees.
Yes.
Of which there are about 3 or 4 groups or species.
Oh, many, many species. I don't even know how many genera, but there are probably hundreds of kinds that have been tried to, have been brought to California. But there's only a handful you see commonly in our cities. I would say probably 6 that you see over and over again. Mm-hmm. And there's only one of those species that's actually native to the state of California. That's the California fan palm, which is the kind that grows in the desert oases like Palm Canyon by Palm Springs, but it was not native anywhere else, north of that, not native to LA or any of the coasts.
Right. Well, that's kind of an ongoing theme here, because you point out that many of the things you talk about, many of the plants and trees are not native to California.
No, basically 3/4 of my book is about non-native trees, which I thought was appropriate because almost all Californians come from someplace else too. And as a way to kind of understand our history and how much has changed, it's appropriate to focus on the non-natives.
I believe the engineer is a native, so watch out.
Okay.
We're going to come back and talk some more about what is really a very fascinating and important book. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Trees in Paradise, A California History by Jared Farmer. That's the book we're talking about today on Conversations on the Coast. And Sir Peter Crane, author of Ginkgo, has this to say in part about the book: a sweeping and brilliantly observed history of the promise and the pitfalls of the California dream, as seen through the intertwined lives of trees and people. And that's the one thing that you do sell very well, that the lives of the people here in this state are clearly intertwined with their trees.
Yeah. I mean, Californians, I love their gardens. I love their parks. I can't think of another state where so many people have climbed up in trees, for weeks or months or years at a time. Or a state that's advertised its exuberance, its bounty through these endless pictures of palm trees on the beach or orange trees under snow-capped mountains. It's a really remarkable tree landscape. Once I moved here, I started to think about this all the time. I think it helped that I went to school at Stanford for my PhD, and that's a school that has, as its mascot, a dancing tree. It's got this kind of eucalyptus curtain separating it from Palo Alto, which is named after a tree. It has the very ostentatious Palm Drive leading to this mural of Jesus underneath palm trees.
Palm Drive.
Yeah, and the history department is right next to the citrus courtyard, and there's beautiful relict coast live oaks, native trees that also dot campus. So it got me thinking about how California, the treescape here is such an interesting mix of the native, non-native, natural, unnatural, and it's all a big mix, and plants from all over the world as well as plants that only grow here, because California has so many species that only grow here. It's really remarkable.
There's very little that you miss in this book, it seems to me. When I was reading the redwood section, you go on for quite some time about something that you call, or maybe it's not yours originally, called the perpetual last stand for redwoods.
Yeah, I guess that's my term. The idea is that people, especially activists, environmentalists, tree lovers, were animated by this notion that the last stand of the really good trees or the really tall trees or the really ancient trees is about to die, is doomed, will be cut next year.
Yeah.
And people basically talked that way for an entire century. So at some point, this talk of the last stand became, to me, kind of a political resource that was almost inexhaustible. It was a kind of rhetoric to kind of mobilize, activists. I'm not saying that it was made up. It's just like the standards of what counted as like the really special trees that deserve protection kept changing over time. And so that's why you could get people in 1900 and the year 2000 saying that we must act now to save the last stand, because what they meant by the last stand was changing over time as definitions of, say, old growth changed, or definition of what an important tree.
The reason they had to come up with this save the last stand is they were so profligate in their use of the redwood prior to that. Yeah. There's a note, an incident in the book where you write about in the city and county of San Francisco, the Great Fire following the earthquake was really greater than it might have been because they were insulating with redwood wood.
The city required
yes.
people to insulate with redwood. It's unbelievable. And then after the fire, they required a permit to use anything but redwood. It was a wooden city before. It was a wooden city afterwards. I mean, San Francisco basically was built on the stumps of Mendocino County and Humboldt County. It was not the Queen City. It was the wooden city. It's remarkable the whole city didn't burn down. I guess it did in a smaller scale, but it should have burned down much earlier. But there was just this talk in California that this is this everlasting wood, wood that withstands time. And people, I think, started to believe that. And the city said, the fire would have been much worse if we hadn't have used redwood. It's like, well, I guess that's true, but probably having like setbacks between buildings would have been even a better idea.
Before we move on to eucalypts, there's a phrase that you use in here that I don't understand. You talk about, and you use this term rather frequently, radicalism in the redwood forest. Radicalism. And then there's a phrase, I don't know if they're related, a delayed backfire to the Great BBQ.
So the Great BBQ is a term historians use. It was coined in the Progressive era to talk about kind of like the Gilded Age, the robber baron phase. And so my idea is that there was such kind of wasteful, profligate use of redwood trees. I mean, the trees were just sort of cut down indiscriminately, sawed up into mostly sawdust, were burned down, turned into pasture. It was just like the most horrible waste. So it's really kind of no surprise you get a kind of boomerang effect or blowback to this Great BBQ, this idea that, it's so abundant. It's like, why not just burn it all down? Why not just say use it wastefully? Which is sort of radical in its own way. That's very anti-conservative in the kind of like the classical sense of the word conservative. So you get to a point 100 years later, and you do get environmental activists who are quite radical in their insistence that you must protect every tree.
I got you.
So it's like one kind of radicalism sort of 100 years later begat another. Because like if you look at the history of redwood trees, it's kind of shocking, how they were wasted. So if you care about trees and you have a radical kind of tendency, then I think it's not hard to see how one created the other in the long term.
Yeah. Let's move on to eucalypts.
Okay.
And this is the first of the non-native trees covered in the book. And it is an incredible tree because it grows without any help, it seems.
It did back in the day. It grew phenomenally in California, in part because it's a good climate, but also there were no koalas or insects or diseases or fungi that in Australia preyed on these trees. So it's growing in like a paradise here. So they grew to like sequoia-like size in 50 years. That does not happen today. No. It doesn't happen in other parts of the world. It was just this kind of moment in time when eucalypts grew that fast and that preternaturally healthy.
We have to take a break, but we're not finished with eucalypts. Don't go away.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Trees in Paradise, Jared Farmer. They're on the show today. The subtitle of his book, which is important, so I should say it again, Trees in Paradise, A California History. And Eric J. Dolan, the author of When America First Met China, says in part, a breathtaking, dramatic, and insightful history of California as seen through the rise and the fall of the state's most iconic trees. beautifully written. Every page is a revelation, bringing to vivid life the myriad ways in which California's landscape was transformed by human greed or avarice and desire, often with disastrous results. You will never think about a tree or the California dream in the same way. And this is true. This is true. This gives you a perspective on the history of California and the many meanings of that history that you're not getting if you enter the fray from other viewpoints. But if you're willing to spend time and think about eucalyptus, you'll get there. The tree eucalyptus is not only a favorite of many, but it is also hated by many.
That is true, though the hatred is newer than the love. I want to say that people have only been hating eucalyptus since the 1970s. There was a much longer period of, I think, love. Probably the love peaked, I would say, probably in the mid-20th century. Eucalyptus was planted more than any other tree, probably outside of the horticultural crops, because it was, you don't grow eucalyptus for fruit or anything. It was planted to cure malaria, to change the climate, to create windbreaks, to create firewood, as a speculative timber crop, all sorts of reasons it was planted. But most of those things failed. And it just sort of ended up hanging around as a landscape feature. And eventually California just sort of fell in love with it as an adopted tree. And they wrote poems about it, and they painted paintings about it. And Ansel Adams, took lovely pictures of Robertson Jeffers, the great poet, wrote a sonnet about eucalyptus trees.
How nice.
And then you get to the 1970s, and everything starts to change. For a bunch of reasons. One has to do with, I think, ecology and changing ideas about native, non-native species. But also here in the Bay Area, there was a giant freeze in 1972 in the Berkeley Hills that made people concerned about fire, which some of those fears came true in 1991, as people may recall. And then, as I was mentioning before, this situation of containment where eucalyptus trees used to be growing in this perfect environment with no pests, no insects, nothing. That all changed in the 80s and 90s when, because of container ships and trans-Pacific flights, lots of beetles and other insects that prey on ukes started showing up. So a lot of these trees that were already old started to get sick and die, and there was a drought. And so a lot of them started to become hazardous. So they were hazardous in some cases, and there was this new kind of scientific discourse about invasive non-native species. And so by the year 2000, it's sort of a flora non grata for a lot of environmentalists. But then there's still this kind of core group of people who love eucalyptus trees. And here in San Francisco, there's some ongoing battles about preserving trees.
Well, all of that negative stuff about eucalypts is enough to make a guy turn to citrus.
Okay.
Bring his love to citrus.
Yes.
But that's a horrible place to go, I think.
Why is that?
The way the history of citrus has worked out.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the original vision of citrus, which is about kind of small holdings, run by families, beautiful crops using, minimal amount of seasonal laborers. And today it's basically giant plantations in the Central Valley that's harvested almost entirely by undocumented Mexican workers. It's just pure agribusiness. That is a kind of fall from grace, I suppose. And I mean, originally these towns in Southern California, like Redlands and Ontario and Riverside, had beautiful libraries and opera houses. There was this kind of genteel, almost urbanism in these little colonies. And now you go to the Central Valley, and again, it's just pure agribusiness. There's just groves and shanty towns, basically, under the smog. So it is sort of a fall from grace. But there is a sort of continuity because, I mean, oranges were always about making money. I mean, don't get me wrong. Even, Riverside and Redlands were the two richest places per capita in America circa 1900. There were like more millionaires there than any other place.
That leaves us with one tree, at least, to say something about.
Palm trees.
Palm trees, my goodness. We have palm trees right outside the door of this studio on the Embarcadero.
I want to say that San Francisco, since the dot-com bubble, has had sort of a palmy resurgence. Circa 1900, probably San Francisco had more prominent palms than Los Angeles. I mean, Sacramento, Santa Barbara, San Diego, way ahead of Los Angeles, including San Francisco, which built a bunch of palms for the 1915 World's Fair, but then sort of palms fell out of favor until the 90s, and now, the Embarcadero, and now the Bay Bridge even, they're bringing back palm trees, even though there's a fungal disease that's going to make them sick, just the way the ones on the Embarcadero are sick. But, like AT&T Park, full of palm trees.
Yeah.
But L.A. in the long run just sort of eclipsed, I think, all over every other city in California in palms, but mostly in advertising palms. Because there are other cities that actually have more palms than L.A., but L.A. has the best advertisers and the most TV
they got
cameras.
the big, tall ones. And when you see them and the camera shoots down the street, you know what city we're talking about.
And the camera always looks for them. So it's basically, it's the most photographed city in the world because of the Hollywood film industry, which means that people have this idea that there are palms everywhere, when in fact, actually, there's not that many palm trees. But it doesn't matter because we just associate it.
The other thing, when they put the palms, or talked about putting the palms on the Embarcadero here in San Francisco, there were big articles by so-called experts that said that you can't have palms in San Francisco. And that close to the water, the salt, the fog, the chill.
Well, there are palm trees in Vancouver. I mean, there are certain kind of hardy species from China that will grow.
Yeah.
But the fog here does actually encourage this fungal disease. So the really magnificent ones, the Canary Island date palm that you find on the Embarcadero, they're actually quite vulnerable to this disease, which is always fatal. And these trees are not cheap. The ones from the Bay Bridge are being brought in from Sacramento, and they basically were sold on eBay for thousands of dollars.
You probably have to pay a politician to get the tree, too, beyond the offering price. Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. But there's nothing terrible about this book. It is beautifully researched, wonderfully written, and it'll give you an idea of what this state that we live in is all about that you've never had before. The title of the book, again, is Trees in Paradise, A California History. Good enough to join us today, the author Jared Farmer. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.